Mr. President, fellow delegates, we speak of a region whose destiny has profoundly affected the entire human experience. In the heart of that region, at the very center of its geography and history, lives a very small nation called Israel.
In 67 BCE, Josephus tells us that the Jewish people rebelled, that their temple was burned, that they were driven from their homeland. And yet the Jews continued. Judaism continued. Consequently, Israel became more of a symbol than an actual place in the diasporic Jew's mind. It is as if the idea of being an American were to survive the destruction of America itself. It still depends so heavily upon it. As if 1,000 years after the fall of a nation, a few million people carried on as Americans in exile. The historical home turned into a concept, an ideal sought after but never achieved, as if the towns and cities and words and documents were turned into holy abstractions. Washington, D.C., the pursuit of happiness, the Bill of Rights, next year in Illinois. As Rich Cohen so aptly puts it, Israel took on a spiritual place in Jewish thought. It represented a long-lost life, confidence, and assured continuation of a people in face of ever more grueling pogroms in Russia and persecution worldwide. When in 1948 the Jewish Agency ratified the creation of the Israeli state, it at once embodied all these things. Its creation ensured not only a culture and religion's continued existence, and all that carries with it, but also threw the Middle East into turmoil, sparked decades of war, and placed Judaism in a uniquely vulnerable position. But the country's creation also represented the fulfillment of a people's dream, sign of rebuilding and strength looking towards the future, just 3 years from a war that killed 6 million of her people. Like most early religions, Judaism was dependent on the land it was founded on. Israel was as integral to Judaism as some of the religion's holy books. But after the destruction of the temple, Judaism as a religion had to separate itself. This separation threw the Jewish people onto a very unstable base. As a result, throughout history, Jews have found themselves the scapegoats of society, perpetually the outsiders. In almost every country the Jews first settled, they were looked down upon. Pogroms in East Russia, the Cossack Uprising, the Holocaust. Jews were expelled and killed by the thousands during the Spanish Inquisition, a holy fire that followed them for over 100 years. All these atrocities are due, in great part, to the Jews' status as outsiders, aliens, unwanted, and unfamiliar people. With no home of their own, no nationality to truly cling to, the Jews were in a continually vulnerable position, which led again and again to their persecution, culminating finally in the Holocaust. But it is for these reasons the creation of Israel was not only a turning point worldwide, but marked one of the single greatest events in Judaism. With one action, not only a permanent home was created for her, it was the very assurance of their continued existence, as a religion and a culture. Israel also spiritually returned Judaism to its roots. It finally mended the separation of a people from their home, a religion from its founding site. Most importantly, Judaism has been tied to a singular fixed place and people once again. This need was the spur to Zionism, at the same time its goal and its rallying cry. From the inception of the movement, then known as the Chovevi Zion, Rabbi Elazar in 1884 called Israel a solution to the Jews' problems. Herzl in his 1905 letter to his confidant called Zionism the solution to the Jewish issue. From the first Aliyah in 1882, fully 3 million Jews immigrated to Palestine. Despite opposition from first the Turks, then the British, and finally the Arab population itself, Jews persevered, and at times in the face of grave danger in claiming the Holy Land. It was a belief so fundamental, so deeply rooted in the religion and culture, that none of these obstacles could stop it. Although Israel provided an official home and a natural haven from anti-Semitism, the nation's creation placed the Jewish people in a uniquely vulnerable position, one it had not encountered for nearly 2,000 years. When Israel was created in 1948, it placed the touchstone of the Jewish people back in the realm of the physical. Before, the Jews had no rallying point, no epicenter, a country without a capital until 1948. But as Howard Sackar puts it, capitals can be sacked, temples burned, a nation destroyed. Ideas can't. If Israel were to be gone tomorrow, could Judaism survive? The nation has become a center of not only religion, but a culture, the heartbeat of a people. What were to happen if that heart suddenly stopped beating? It is a subject of great debate whether the Jews would survive their nation's second condemning. Paradoxically, at the same time the newborn country assured her people's continued existence, it provided an opportunity for its complete eradication. And not only did Israel's creation by a measure compromise its security, it also indirectly birthed the means of its own end: constant bitter war. Israel's very existence threw the fledgling country into war from day one. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Suez Crisis, the Six-Day War, the War of Attrition, the Yom Kippur War, the Palestinian War in South Lebanon, the 1982 Lebanon War, the Intifadas. In the first 60 years of the country's history, it has fought over a dozen wars and been a center of violence and friction in the Middle East. Bluntly put, the country's creation was the catalyst for countless of lives lost. But this is because, among other things, Israel greatly changed the makeup of the Middle East, planting a relatively small, new, fragile nation directly in the middle of extremely hostile neighbors. Unfortunately, with the nation's birth, it unwittingly ushered in an era of fragile alliances. The Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, the Israeli-Hezbollah War, all a result of Israel's creation. The country's birth sparked a flame that is still burning to this day. But turmoil in the Middle East also had another subtler effect. Because of the numerous wars and constant threats to the country's safety, Israel has turned into a much more controlling state, openly prejudiced against Palestinians and participating daily in acts of questionable morals. The blockade of Gaza, the shelling of civilian villages in Lebanon, bulldozing of Palestinian settlements, the infamous Black Flag trial in 1972. These are all examples of a government that has lost consideration for none but their own. If the leaders of the early Zionist organization could see present-day Israel, they would hardly recognize it. Most of the Zionists envision a lasting peace between the Jews and Arabs, a mutually beneficial relationship between sister peoples. Unfortunately, this vision did not manifest, and decades of war have not only impacted the area around Israel, but also changed the country and culture of the people itself. If Israel were not to have existed, the people, their religion, and their culture all would be something quite different than today. The root of this continued violence can be found in the creation of Israel itself. While being the realization of one people's dreams, the nation's birth also effectively subjugated those of another, the Arabs. Unfortunately, at the mid-century, the Holy Land was a sort of zero-sum. There was not enough room in either faction's plans for two nations. And to exacerbate things, the British Mandate government prohibited all cross-culture talks without government oversight. So as violence increased leading up to Britain's withdrawal in 1948, there were no lines of communication between the two peoples, no room for compromise in the hearts of their leaders. Israel became a nation. The forgotten implication, equally as important, is that Palestine did not. In one of Herzl's earliest plays on the subject matter, he raises the question of a divided Palestine, confusion at the thought that Jews and Arabs would be alienated so. The Jews have enriched us. Why should we have anything against them? They live with us like brothers. Why should we not love them? Unfortunately, Herzl's vision failed to point out the fact that Arabs and Jews did not work side by side, that living in what has been the cradle of three world religions pushed both peoples to extremes. To both the Jews and Arabs, as the years wore on, and the violence escalated, it became not our land, but their land, my land. And as more and more Jews migrated to Palestine after World War II, the Arabs felt increasingly threatened by their growing presence. Water resources from the Jordan became scarce and strictly controlled. Industry and commerce from the Mediterranean were firmly in Jewish hands, while the Arabs still dominated the population in agriculture. But rather than pooling resources, these two people became more and more isolated. And mounting external pressures outside of the Holy Land only exacerbated each side. Immigration, government favoritism, politics, tariffs, trade, business and industry, all these progressed with renewed vigor. Rather than releasing tension in the light of economic success, they only put momentum behind the violence. To further exacerbate the situation, what would later be known as the Axis powers spent a great amount of time and money to get their propaganda into the country, looking to weaken Britain's hold on the Middle East and Africa. By 1948, the issue was decided. Israel fought its first war within 24 hours of the nation's birth, cementing hostilities that can still be felt today. This one day in history is so important because that's where one can point back to for the origin of the state of present affairs, and why it is so hard to work backwards towards peace.